Imagine this, the flickering glow of a watch dial in the dark. A delicate, ethereal shimmer guiding soldiers through the trenches of World War I. A marvel of modern science, a beacon of human ingenuity. But behind this glow lay a silent, invisible executioner, claiming its victims one by one. The women who brought this innovation to life were the Radium Girls, young factory workers whose delicate hands painted the luminescent dials. They toiled under the illusion of safety, each stroke of their brush laced with radium, a substance praised as a medical miracle. They were told it was harmless, even beneficial. They trusted the scientists. They trusted their employers. They were wrong. What followed was one of the most horrifying medical tragedies of the 20th century, one that exposed the darkest corners of industrial greed, medical ignorance, and human suffering. The early 1900s were an age of scientific marvels. Radium, discovered by Marie Curie in 1898, was hailed as a wonder element. It was infused into everything, beauty creams, tonics, even drinking water, marketed as an elixir for youth and vitality. One of its most lucrative applications was in luminescent paint, used to make watch dials glow in the dark. The U.S. Radium Corporation, USRC, and other companies opened factories across the country, hiring young women, many still in their teens, to paint these dials. The job was well-paying, respectable, and even glamorous. But there was a catch. To achieve precision, the women were taught a technique known as lip pointing. After each stroke, they were instructed to place the tip of the brush between their lips to create a fine point. With each lick, they unknowingly ingested microscopic particles of radium. Some workers were skeptical. The paint glowed in the dark. That had to mean something, right? But supervisors dismissed their concerns, assuring them that radium was perfectly safe. Some even suggested it was good for their health. And so they painted. They painted while laughing and chatting, their lips glowing faintly in the dim factory light. They dusted radium onto their dresses for fun, their bodies shimmering like celestial beings when they walked home at night. They were called the Ghost Girls, radiant, beautiful, unaware that the glow was the first sign of their doom. The effects of radium poisoning were not immediate. It began subtly: aches in the jaw, fatigue, teeth that felt loose in their sockets. Then the real horror began. Molly Maggia, one of the first victims, was just 24 when her nightmare started. Her teeth began falling out, one by one. Her jawbone crumbled, disintegrating at the lightest touch. Her breath reeked of decay, though no infection could be found. Then abscesses formed, seeping pus and blood. When doctors examined her, they discovered the unspeakable. Her jawbone had rotted so thoroughly that they could remove it by simply reaching into her mouth and lifting it out. And still, no one knew why. More women fell ill, each suffering in unspeakable agony. Their bones became brittle, breaking under their own weight. They developed massive tumors, some grotesquely distorting their bodies. Holes formed in their skulls, their spines collapsed, and their limbs shattered from the simplest movements. Doctors were baffled. Some misdiagnosed the symptoms as syphilis, tarnishing the women's reputations and dismissing their claims. Others refused to treat them at all. But behind closed doors, scientists working for U.S. Radium already knew the truth. As early as 1901, studies showed that radium was deadly when ingested. The company's chemists took precautions, handling the substance with gloves, wearing lead aprons, using tongs to avoid direct contact. But the workers, they were never warned. Even as the women deteriorated, their employers denied responsibility. They stalled investigations, falsified medical reports, and hired experts to blame the women's suffering on poor hygiene or pre-existing conditions. Some women, desperate for justice, were gaslit into believing their pain was their own fault. It was an industrial cover-up of monstrous proportions. By the late 1920s, the truth could no longer be contained. The bodies piled up, and so did the lawsuits. The Radium Girls, many now wheelchair-bound, their jaws wired shut to prevent collapse, took their fight to court. One of the most famous cases was that of Grace Fryer, a former dial painter. She spent 2 years searching for a lawyer willing to take on U.S. Radium. Most refused, either out of fear or financial interest. But eventually a case was built. The trial was a spectacle. The women, so sick they could barely sit upright, were forced to testify while their bodies disintegrated. Their attorneys demonstrated the effects of radium poisoning with chilling evidence, including bones that glowed in the dark when held up to ultraviolet light. The defense argued the women had brought this upon themselves. They claimed radium wasn't to blame, despite overwhelming proof. They delayed, hoping the plaintiffs would die before a verdict could be reached. Many did. But the case set a precedent. In 1928, the Radium Girls finally won, forcing companies to take responsibility for their crimes. It was one of the first instances of worker safety regulations triumphing over corporate greed. Their case led to the establishment of labor protection laws, paving the way for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. But for the women, it was too late. Radium poisoning is irreversible. The element embeds itself into bone, where it continues to emit deadly radiation for centuries. Decades after their deaths, when scientists exhumed the remains of Radium Girls for research, their bones still glowed in the dark. Even in death, they could not escape their executioner. Today, their story stands as both a warning and a monument to resilience. The Radium Girls were victims of one of the most horrific medical missteps in history, but they were also pioneers. Their suffering led to life-saving labor laws, forever changing how workers are treated. But justice came at a cruel cost. As you glance at the glow of a watch dial or marvel at the luminescence of modern technology, remember those who paid the ultimate price for that glow. They were the ghost girls, women who shined in the darkness, not because of beauty or joy, but because their very bones pulsed with the radiation that killed them. Their glow was their death sentence, and it still haunts us to this day. The Radium Girls' story did not end in the courtroom. Their legacy extended far beyond the settlements they won, shaping the future of workplace safety, scientific ethics, and industrial accountability. But for the survivors, there was no true victory. Many of the women who fought for justice did not live long enough to see its full impact. Their bodies, ravaged by radium poisoning, continued to betray them. Some succumbed within months of the trial's conclusion. Others lived for years, their bones crumbling, their organs failing, their every movement a reminder of the unseen enemy within. Yet in their suffering, they left behind something powerful, a fight that would inspire change long after they were gone. By the time the Radium Girls took their battle to court, scientists had already begun to understand the deadly nature of radium exposure. But the evidence had been ignored, suppressed, or deliberately concealed. One of the leading researchers to confirm radium's destructive power was Dr. Harrison Martland, a pathologist who conducted extensive autopsies on the women. His findings were chilling. The radium had replaced the calcium in their bones, making their skeletons brittle and porous. The radiation continued to burn them from within, causing their very cells to self-destruct. Their bodies had become radioactive tombs. Martland's research proved beyond doubt that radium was no miracle cure. It was a slow, merciless killer. His work paved the way for modern radiation safety protocols, but it was small comfort to those who had already been poisoned. Even more disturbingly, later studies found that radium poisoning was hereditary. The daughters of some Radium Girls reported unusual health issues, though the full extent of the genetic damage remains unclear. The poison did not simply kill, it left scars in the bloodlines of those it touched. The most haunting aspect of the Radium Girls' legacy is what happened after their deaths. Even decades later, their remains continue to emit radiation. Scientists have exhumed their bones for study, finding that their skeletons still glow under ultraviolet light. Some of these women were buried in lead-lined coffins to contain the radiation. Others, in ordinary graves, continue to release low levels of radiation into the soil. In cemeteries across the country, their tombstones mark not just their final resting places, but a permanent reminder of industrial negligence. Even in death, the Radium Girls could not escape the luminous curse that had been painted onto their bones. The Radium Girls story is not just a tragedy of the past, it is a warning that echoes into the present. History is filled with similar tales, cases where industries ignored or concealed deadly risks to protect their profits. From asbestos exposure to lead poisoning, from pharmaceutical disasters to modern-day environmental crises, the same pattern repeats. Corporations prioritize profit over people, and the victims are left to suffer the consequences. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications. We're always bringing you more exciting content, and in the next video, we'll dive into even more amazing topics that you won't want to miss. Stay tuned for the next one.